Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now in the second week for the comparative study of law. I just arrived at the studio. It is gloomy outside. Climate change is obvious around us. So, in this class, I'll present a basic picture of a comparative understanding of law. The argument would come from a Professor Harold Berman, who is an American legal scholar and was respected as one of a polymaths of American legal education in the United States. The article was titled Law and Revolution, the Formation of the Western Legal Tradition. It featured in Harvard University Press and the journal. This was an article featured is named an Introduction to Comparative Law. And the other argument was based on Leonard David, who is a French scholar, and his argument presents 9 elements of a criteria denoting the Western legal tradition. And his prime message would be on the socialist legal traditions, whether it can be viewed as part of a Western legal family. And also in the first proposition with the main characteristics of a Western legal tradition, covering various points of a distinction or about legal system generally and against other traditions of law. So we reviewed the 2 types of arguments to understand the comparative perspective, and we'll further on some notes about a socialist legal tradition, which will involve the previous discussion presented by Leonard David. As the political economy now made the world into sharp contrast between liberalist and communist camps, so it is interesting to explore the kind of differences and a definition of a Western legal tradition in comparison with a specific socialist progeny. And we also expected to review the ancient laws, which covers the kind of a primitive form of laws, including hammer of code and other Greek type of laws. The principal reason why we neglect on this kind of remnants would be not for its underdevelopment, rather the artifacts would not support the study of ancient laws. Generally, the comparatists begin with a Justinian code when they think about the comparative legal tradition. And generally for the common law lawyers, they have loose on a 11th and 12th century a great event, what they call a Norman conquest of Duke Williams. So the common law tradition has a turning point beyond the inner circle of a Roman law tradition and made their way to sally forward through the prosperity of the current form of a delicate and extensive forms of a common law legal culture. So then, let's begin with the article titled "The Western Conception of Law," which is featured in International Encyclopedia of Comparative Law. It was wrote in 1975. And I'd rather return to the former article titled Law and Revolution, the Formation of the Western Legal Tradition. Sorry, I need to start this one first. So in this article, we need to define some kind of legal context, the word West. What is West? If we talk about the West, we have many ideas about, which would be a political, or in cases, a geographical. Some historians would argue against the concept of West, principally because the term was coined by a Western hegemony. So kind of a debate would evolve in terms of a historical perspective. We generally derive some kind of basic elements, however, when we think about the West. We tell the following story. There was a civilization called West that it developed distinctive legal institutions, values, and concepts. These Western legal institutions, values, and concepts were consciously transmitted from a generation to generation of centuries, and this came to constitute the tradition. The Western legal tradition was born of a revolution, and thereafter, during the course of many centuries, has been periodically interrupted and transformed by revolutions. And then in the 20th century, the Western legal tradition is in a revolution crisis greater than any other in its history. One, some believe, has brought it virtually to an end. So as the modern democracy was the creature of a brutal revolution and a kind of a enclave of a communist revolution, the West will generally produce a kind of dominant culture about the contemporary time framework of a politics for each nation. For example, Koreans, China, or Japanese, and other Asian states may have some of indigenous culture in terms of law and a political virtue, but they are generally merged in many aspects with a kind of a structure and a spirit of a Western democracy. So we first like to see some basic feature of the West. What is called the West in this discourse is a particular historical culture or civilization which can be characterized in many different ways depending on the purpose of the characterization. It used to be called the Occident and was taken to comprise all the cultures that succeeded to the heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, as contrast with the Orient, which consists chiefly of Islam, India, and the Far East. Since the end of World War II, East and West have often been used to distinguish communists from non-communist countries. In East-West trade, a shipment of goods from Prague to Tokyo is a shipment from East to West. You may also be familiar with another approach between the East and West conceptualization, which is less well known today. The distinction between the East and Western parts of the Christian church, which in the early countries of the Christian era parallel the distinction between the Eastern and Western parts of the Roman Empire. Although there were differences between the Eastern church and the Western church from an early time, it was only in 1054 that they split apart. Their separation coincided with the Western movement to make the Bishop of Rome the sole head of the church, to emancipate the clergy from the control of emperor, kings, and feudal laws, and sharply to differentiate the church as a political and legal entity from secular polities. This movement, culminating in what was called the Gregorian Reformation and the investiture struggle, gave rise to the formation of the first modern Western legal system, the new canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, and eventually to new secular legal systems as well, royal, urban, and others. So this incident is historically important to separate the state authority and a religion. So it's kind of a germinating context where we can discern some kind of secular laws from a pure religious ones. In the 11th and 12th centuries, these were the peoples of Western Europe, from England to Hungary and from Denmark to Sicily. Countries such as Russia and Greece, which remain in the Eastern Orthodox Church, as well as large parts of Spain, which were Muslim, were excluded at the time. In later time, not only were Russia and Greece and all of Spain westernized, but also North and South America and various other parts of the world as well. So after review, we will make a brief visit to the investiture incident and a Gregorian Reformation later in the class. The West then is not found by records to compass. Geographical boundaries help to locate it, but they shift from time to time. The West is rather a cultural term, but with a very strong diachronic dimension. It is not, however, simply an idea. It is a community. It implies both a historical structure and structural history. For many centuries, it could be identified very simply as the people of Western Christendom. Indeed, from the 11th to 15th centuries, the community of those people was manifested in the common allegiance to single spiritual authority, the Church of Rome. As a historical culture, a civilization, the West is to be distinguished not only from the West, but also from pre-Western cultures, to which it returned in various periods of a renaissance. Such returns and revivals are characteristics of the West. They are not to be confused with the models on which they drew for inspiration. Israel, Greece, and Rome became spiritual ancestors of the West, and primarily by process of survival or succession, but primarily by a process of adoption. This is the point where comparisons need to focus throughout their studies. We have to move forward and backward because the legal tradition is kind of a permanent and everlasting, even if the revolutions from time to time interrupted to seize the lives, but the continuance would be a key words that we need to forbear in our elaboration. Moreover, it adopted them selectively, different parts at different times. Cotton Mather was no Hebrew. Erasmus was no Greek. The Roman lawyers of the University of Bologna were non-Romans. Some Roman law, to be sure, survived in the Germanic folklore, and more important, in the law of church. Some Greek philosophy also survived in the church. The Hebrew Bible, of course, survived as the Old Testament, but such survivals only account for a small part of the influence on Western law, Western philosophy, and Western theology. What accounted for the major part of the influence were the rediscoveries, re-examinations, and receptions of the ancient texts. We later see how the Roman law prospered even after the collapse of Rome, which was clustered in a medieval cities, such as Paris and Oxford, Cambridge, and other continental cities. Even to the extent that ancient learning may be said to have survived without interruption, it was inevitably transformed. This point is especially important for understanding of the rediscovery and revival of Roman law. By no stretch of the imagination can the legal system say of the 12th century free city of Pisa, which adopted many of the rules of Roman law found in the newly rediscovered text of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, be identified with the legal system of the empire over which Justinian reigned. The same formulas carried very important meanings. The West, from this perspective, is not Greece and Rome and Israel, but the peoples of Western Europe, turning to the Greek and Roman and Hebrew texts for inspiration, and transforming those texts in ways that would have astonished the authors. Nor, of course, is Islam part of the West, although there were strong Arabic influences on Western philosophy and science, though not on Western legal institutions, especially in the period with which their study is concerned. Indeed, each of the ancient ingredients of Western culture was transformed by being mixed with the others. The amazing thing is that such antagonistic elements could be brought together into a single worldview. The Hebrew culture would not tolerate a Greek philosophy or Roman law. The Greek culture would not tolerate Roman law or Hebrew theology. The Roman culture would not tolerate a Hebrew theology, and it resisted a large part of Greek philosophy. Yet the West, in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, combined all three and thereby transformed each one. Somewhat more controversial is the distinction between the West and the culture of the Germanic and other tribal peoples of Europe before the 11th century. If West a geographical term, then early culture would have to be included. Indeed, one would have to start, as most studies of European history do, with Caesar's Gallic Wars, the invasion of Roman Empire by the Germanic peoples, and the rise of the Frankish monarchy, and Charlemagne and Alfred the Great, before coming to the Gregorian Reformation, the investiture struggle, and what is usually called the High Middle Ages or the Renaissance of the 12th century. To speak of Germanic peoples of Europe as pre-Western may sound strange to some ears, yet there was a radical discontinuity between the Europe of the period before the years 1050 through 1150, and the Europe of the period after the years 1050 through 1150. Finally, it needs to be said in connection with the meaning of the word Western, that at least for the purpose of analyzing and explaining legal institutions, no sharp distinction should be made between a Western and modern. And further, the modern should be differentiated from a contemporary by applying modern to the period prior to the two world wars and contemporary to the period since 1945. One of the purposes of this study is to show that in the West, modern times, not only modern legal institutions and modern legal values, but also the modern state, the modern church, modern philosophy, and the modern university, modern literature, and much else that is modern have their origin in the period 1015 through 1115 and not before. In this period, we can see the event of a Roman conquest. So the interaction between the continent and now Great Britain brings us to a critical stage of a Western system. The term legal, like the term Western, has a history. Law these days is usually defined as a body of laws. The laws, in turn, are usually sought to derive from statutes, and where judicial lawmaking is recognized from court decisions. From this point of view, however, there could be no such a thing as Western law, since there is no Western legislature or court. Such a definition of law is entirely too narrow for any study that embraces the legal systems of all countries of the West in all the various periods of Western history, and which is concerned not only with the law in books, but also with law in action. Law in action involves legal institutions and procedures, legal values and legal concepts and ways of thought, as well as legal laws. It involves what is sometimes called the legal process, or what in German is called Rechtsverwirklichung, the realizing of law. So we now turn to see the term law to make up for the full word Western legal tradition. What is law? We may see first it denotes a body of laws, and we may think about in dichotomy between law in books and law in action. So law would also be the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to the governance of laws, primacy of legal activity over legal laws. We need to be flexible to approach the concept of law. We need to be more accommodating to recognize law in more a broad context. Lon L. Fuller has defined law as the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to the governance of laws, as I mentioned. This definition rightly stresses the primacy of legal activity over legal laws. And I will go further by adding to the purpose of the enterprise, not just the making and applying of the laws, but also other modes of governance, including the casting of votes, the issuing of orders, the appointment of officials, and the handing down of judgments. Also, the law has purposes other than governance, in the usual sense of the word. It is an enterprise for facilitating voluntary arrangements through the negotiation of transactions, the issuance of documents, and the performance of other acts of a legal nature. Law in action consists of people legislating, adjudicating, administering, negotiating, and carrying on other legal activities. It is a living process of allocating rights and duties, and thereby resolving conflicts and creating channels of cooperation. Such a broad concept of law is needed in order to compare within a single framework the many specific legal systems that have existed in the West during many centuries. It is needed also in order to explore the interrelationship of these systems with other political, economic, and social institutions, values, and concepts. I have taken the liberty of defining law in general terms without reference to the particular legal institutions, values, and concepts that characterize the Western legal traditions. then we need to see what the tradition is. When you take the tradition in view of a comparative purpose, we need to derive two major historical facts as I've introduced. The first event was a comparative from the late 11th and 12th century on the conscious development of law. And the tradition conceived as a process, not merely of change, but of organic growth, conscious growth toward particular legal ideas. But we need to see the emphasis on its ongoing character, which is traditional, but could be adapted to a changing circumstances, which may be undertaken in the forms of revolution in extreme cases, and other reformative a form of a legal change. And therefore, we can see two distinguished events for the Western law years, which is a Norman conquest and the Justinian Code, a creation of Justinian Code, for comparative purpose. To speak of traditional law in the West is to call attention to two major historical facts. As said, first, that from the late 11th and 12th centuries on, except in certain periods of revolution change, legal institutions in the West developed continuously of generations and centuries, with each generation constantly building on the work of a previous generation. And second, that this conscious process of continuous development is conceived as a process not merely of change, but of organic growth. Even the great national revolutions of the past, the Russian Revolution of 1970, the French and American revolutions of 1789 and 1776, the English Revolution of 1640, and the German Reformation of 1517, eventually made peace with the legal tradition that they or some of their leaders had set out to destroy. Paradoxically, the most sacrifices would be made of a legal professions in times. Also, in contrast, the most contributing force was drawn from a legal profession also. And the law would generally tend to survive the revolution in terms of its legal history and traditional through the various centuries and over a world history. The concept of conscious organic development was applied in the 11th and 12th centuries to institutions. In this context, the term institution means structured arrangements for performing specific social tasks. Universities, for example, are institutions for transmitting higher education and training professionals. The financial and judicial departments of government are institutions for administering taxation and justice, respectively. The legal system is a structured system of arrangements, one of whose primary purposes is to provide guidance to the various departments of government as well as to people generally concerning what is permitted and what is prohibited. In the West, in the 11th and 12th centuries, not only the newly created universities, exchequers and courts, and legal systems were viewed as developing institutions, but even the church came to be so viewed. So also did a secular structure such as urban and royal governments. These various institutions were conceived as having an ongoing character. They were expected gradually to adapt to new situations, to reform themselves, and to grow over long periods of time. In part, such growth was planned. Many cathedrals, for example, were planned to be built over generations and centuries. That budgets, literally for 1,000 years. In part, the growth was not so much planned as engineered. Administrators and legislators revised the work of their predecessors, disciples, set out to improve on the work of their masters. The commentators succeeded glossators. In part, growth seemed less to be planned or engineered than just to happen. For example, architects combined Romanesque with Norman, and out of that there emerged early Gothic, which developed into later Gothic and so on. As Robert Nesbit says, no one sees society grow or develop or decay or die. These are all metaphors. Nevertheless, the belief of people living in a society in a given time that the society is in fact growing or developing, decaying or dying, is a very real thing. In the formative year of the Western legal tradition, the older Augustinian belief the society, the earlier city, is continually decaying, was modified by a new belief the social institutions are capable of birth and growth and reproduction. Moreover, this process was conceived to be one in which successive generations consciously and actively participate. As Goethe said, a tradition cannot be inherited. It has to be earned. The great English historian, after Maitland, made use of the biological metaphor of growth to describe the change that took place in the English law, relating to the forms of action in the 12th century and thereafter. So we need to summarize the characteristics of the Western legal tradition. This point was elaborated by Harold J. Berman in the article as I have denoted. We can derive a scope of characteristics, including distinction among neighboring concepts and entrustment to special corps of people. And the Western legal tradition also see special training about its profession, and particularly in the medieval times, the university offers a basis of, for the glossators and other legal researchers. And it provides a body of legal learning, which is detailed and also instructive through the society as a whole, and which would offer a kind of a standard to which we need to conform. And the Western legal tradition generates the concept of law as a corpus juris. And as you introduced, we need to focus the point of ongoing character of law. So there is kind of internal logic on the growth of law. It grows. It did not stop definitely to in any authoritarian way. It is sociological in nature over many aspects, and it can grow and may change and may be reformed for betterness of society. So the concept of legal supremacy was normally embraced by Westerners, and it is also involved with kind of logic on historicity of law, and multi-jurisdiction also enabled to see the law as supreme. One jurisdiction may go easily on a kind of a tyranny or some absolute form of governance. So comparative legal study also serves this purpose for the law and legal profession. And the kind of legal pluralism is dominant pattern of a Western legal tradition. So tension, ideas versus realities, a kind of words in contrast need to be explored to grasp this essence. I'd like to introduce over the rest parts of a characteristics in more depth. In the Western legal tradition, law is conceived to be coherent whole as an integral system, a body, and this body is conceived to be developing in time over generations and centuries. The concept of law as a corpus juris might be thought to be implicit in every legal tradition, in which law is viewed as distinct from morality and from custom, and it is often supposed that such a concept was not only implicit but also explicit in the Roman law of Justinian. However, the phrase corpus juris Romani was not used by the Romans, but by the 12th and 13th century European canonists, Romanists, who extrapolated the concept from the work of those who 1 or 2 centuries earlier had discovered the old Justinian text and taught them in the European universities. It was the 12th century scholastic technique of reconciling contradictions and deriving a general concepts from rules and cases that first made it possible to coordinate and integrate the Roman law of Justinian. The concept of a body or system of law depended for its vitality on the belief in the ongoing character of law, its capacity for growth over generations and centuries, a belief which is uniquely Western. The body of law only survives because it contains a built-in mechanism for organic change. The growth of law is thought to have an internal logic. Changes are not only adaptations of the old to the new, but also part of a pattern of changes. The process of development is subject to certain regularities, and at least in hindsight reflects an inner necessity. It is presupposed in the Western legal tradition that changes do not occur at random, but proceed by reinterpretation of the past to meet present and future needs. The law is not merely ongoing, it has a history, it tells a story. The historicity of law is linked with the concept of its supremacy over the political authorities. The developing body of law, both at any given moment and in the long run, is conceived by some, although not by all, and not necessarily even by most, to be binding upon the state itself. Although it remained for the American Revolution to contribute to world constitutionalism, nevertheless, since the 12th century, in all countries of the West, even under absolute monarchies, it has been widely said and often accepted that in some important respects, law transcends politics. The monarch, it is argued, may make law, but he may not make it arbitrarily, and until it is remedied lawfully, he is bound by it. The kind of a social practices may offer a basis for the higher law concept in medieval England, and also the kind of work developed by Blackstone may plainly prove the supremacy of law over politics. but as a matter of a human business, there could be some tension between a political power and a province. Kind of a star chamber would notoriously be built for the instruments of a absolute Tudor dynasty in some cases. We see later briefly when we explore the Commonwealth tradition later in the class. Perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of the Western legal tradition is the coexistence and competition with the same community of diverse jurisdictions and diverse legal systems. It is this plurality of jurisdictions and legal systems that makes the supremacy of law both necessary and possible. Legal pluralism originated in the differentiation of the ecclesiastical polity from a secular polity. The Church declared its freedom from secular control, its exclusive jurisdiction in some matters, and its a concurrent jurisdiction in other matters. Laymen, though governed generally by secular law, were subject to ecclesiastical law and to the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical courts in matters of marriage and family relations, inheritance, spiritual crimes, contract relations where a faith was pledged, and a number of other matters as well. The very complexity of common legal order containing diverse legal systems contributed to legal sophistication. Which court has jurisdiction? Which law is applicable? How are legal differences to be reconciled? Behind the technical questions lay important political and economic considerations: church versus crown, crown versus town, town versus law, law versus merchant, and so on. Law was a way of resolving the political and economic conflicts, yet law could also serve to exacerbate them. The pluralism of Western law, which has both reflected and reinforced the pluralism of Western political and economic life, has been or once was a source of development or growth, legal growth, as well as political and economic growth. It also has been or once was a source of freedom. A serf might turn to the town court for protection against his master. A vassal might run to the king's court for protection against his role. A cleric might turn to the ecclesiastical court for protection against the king. There is tension between the ideas and realities, between the dynamic qualities and the stability, between the transcendence and the immanence of the Western legal tradition. This tension has periodically led to the violent overthrow of legal systems by revolution. Nevertheless, the legal tradition, which is something bigger than any of the legal systems that comprise it, survived and indeed was renewed by such revolutions. One other useful discourse arises from the context of 9 elements of Western law, proposed by Professor Jeffrey Sulfur in the article titled The Western Conception of Law. This article featured, as I introduced, International Encyclopedia of Comparative Law. His secondary introduced to facilitate our understanding around geographical spread and 9 elements of a Western law. A purely external or behaviorist description of the legal system of countries, usually including the expression Western, will show innumerable differences in all the features of legal systems mentioned of our meditation. Even at a broad level of comparison, they include two major subsystems. Those derived from the Romano-German codes of continental Europe, and those derived from the English and common law. So we later explored three major legal traditions. Before that, we need to be detailed over the geographical and historical meditation to define the Western more comprehensively. The nations, which are Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Switzerland, West Germany, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, the United Kingdom, Ireland, all the nations of North, Central, South America, and adjacent islands, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, are classed as Western. So there are groups very distinctive each other in some sense. A vaguely may be grouped into a kind of a common tradition, but more kind of sensitized need to be applied to see the nature of legal tradition. And in this contemporary times, legal pluralism would cover the kind of a national context to denote a diverse legal culture, not just between the contrasts as introduced earlier in this class. In summing up the consideration of Western legal tradition, we need to consider some objections to the formulations of the great comparatists mentioned in the first division. If we dwell too much on the detailed differences in legal classification, concepts, and professional and judicial techniques as between various Western countries, in particular the Romanist countries, as compared with those of the English common law, we are left with no satisfactory basis on which to distinguish Western law as a whole from non-Western laws. If we will refer to the broad cultural influences which have been common to Western legal systems, such as Christianity, political democracy, and economic capitalism, we face the difficulty that not all these have affected all the countries concerned in equal degree, and some of these influences have changed the good deal in the course of past 2 centuries. Christianity has in all cases become a less direct influence, and the teachings peculiar to Christianity have in some cases ceased to be an influence at all. Political democracy has in some cases been an ephemeral influence, and in all cases has been subject to challenge. The political democracy without economic democracy is insufficient or given a sham. So the introduction of Geoffrey Shaw is a more dimensional rather than a phenomenological in-depth analysis of a Western concept. And we now see 9 elements of Western law presented in the article. Let's see. The Western law normally shows a historical tradition, and also the point on professional specialization goes the same as the former, as introduced. And so a kind of doctrinal autonomy is intrinsic, enshrined in Western law, and also a formal drives the point of formal organization as essence of Western law. And he also saw Western law as kind of product which are produced by social demands. So the interaction between law and society is critical to understand the nature of law and the prescriptions that the society prefers. And the law can exist when it contributes to society. So it may subject to the values of society and also demands of society. And the Western law has some commonality in terms of sources of law. And in the context, as we see later, imperativism or positivism, kind of ideas about the nature of law would be explored briefly. And we also find a common basis about theories of law in Western law. First, Western law in its various forms has a long, rich historical tradition, which directly derives from or has in a material degree been influenced by Roman law. Many systems have a tradition going back to the 5th century BC at least, but this one is peculiar for the very wide social reach of the concepts, principles, and rules, which is developed at a very early stage of its development. Second, Western law early developed and has maintained or increased high degree of professional specialization, or putting it another way, a high degree of social separateness of the elements, legal profession and judiciary, particularly concerned with legal administration. This contrasts with systems in which legal expertise has been closely associated with the performance of religious tasks or with governmental administration. The relative weight of different sections of the legal specialists in Western systems has varied a good deal, with a characteristic stress on judges and practitioners in the English common law and on university commentators and teachers in the Romanist countries. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, in all cases, the autonomous life of the law has depended in an increasing degree on the active and intimate cooperation of all three main segments: practicing lawyers, judges, and academic commentators and teachers. Third, Western law exhibits a high degree of doctrinal autonomy. Whatever view is taken of the ultimate source of the validity or of the logical determinants or the value of elements or of the sociological determinants in the law, the actual development of the law, both in its detailed daily adaptation to the change, so and sudden in social organization, and its more macroscopic changes, as by legislation and codification, has been strongly influenced by the classifications and concepts of the legal specialists. At various times, major legal changes have been brought about by the direct intervention of political forces from outside the realm of the legal specialists. Changes in which professional lawyers have played some but a subordinate part, but the absorption of changes and the direction of the new developments which they began have usually been once again due to the constructive legal logic of the specialist professions. Fourth, the course of development of Western law by professional activity has tended to produce systems having a relatively high degree of formal organization with some consistency and symmetry of actions, definitions, and rules of conceptual development. The degree of such a symmetry varies a good deal from country to country and from time to time, with rather less stress on such factors in the English common law than in Romanist systems. And in all cases, is a good deal less than purely academic commentators, having no responsibility for practical legal administration, are inclined to advocate. The basis of systemization, moreover, is apt to be historical rather than logical in the sense of propositional calculus. However, the urge of the specialized legal professions, if left to themselves, is usually in the direction of increased consistency and symmetry. Fifth, the trend towards professional system has at all times been counteracted by the specific experience of social problems of the time, which results from the interaction of the legal professionals with the wider society, more specifically by the demands made upon the lawyers and the system by the clients, whether were governments or individuals or social groups. Six, Western law has tended to be a pervasive element in Western society. That is, the extent to which social control is exerted through law rather than through other social forces has always been relatively large. This has been a particularly marked feature of Western societies in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the sphere of private law, an interesting example is the rapid growth and elaboration of law concerning employment relations, partly by the development of basic code and common law provisions, partly by special statutory law and the development of a specialized tribunals to deal with labor management disputes. In the sphere of public law, a most important Western development has been the growth of constitutional and administrative law along lines subjecting the state and its officials and even legislative bodies to legal controls. The highest legal control is the power of judicial review of legislation exerted by constitutional courts in the Western countries, which have federal constitutions, notably the United States of America, Canada, Australia, and West Germany, or which have judicially protected entrenched fundamental guarantees of human rights, notably by the United States of America, West Germany, and Italy. But in all cases, the growth of administrative law, often accompanied by the development of specialized tribunals, has brought into existence an elaborate system of principles and remedies to deal with wrongful or oppressive acts by state officials and institutions. And this kind of context will serve crucially for the concept of rule of law, which has long evolved through the Western traditions. And seventh, the technical expression of Western law has tended to converge towards a mixture of codes or partial codes, specialized statutes of heterogeneous character, and reported a judicial decisions, which in their own terms, or as handled by professional and academic legal commentators, fill out and develop the basic law. In the 19th century, there appeared the possibility of sharp divergence between the previously Romanist and the English common law system, the former relying almost wholly on general codes, as developed by university teachers and commentators, and the latter relying almost wholly on the enacted common law derived from and developed by judicial decisions. So later we see the Napoleonic Code, which is exemplary of the development of Romanist legal culture. And this distinction still lies in the background of two systems. The convergence has occurred because of the extent of partial codification in English common law countries, and of reporting and reliance on judicial decisions in the Romanist countries, and the vast extension of specialized statutory law in both. So in the province of English common law, there are also trends to make a statute, particularly on a public law sector, and once codified, it preempts the case law, but as limited to the designated purpose of the statute and a specific language of a provisions. And as Western law has produced an extraordinarily rich and varied body of speculative thought concerning the nature, organization, authority, and social relations of law, especially in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Abandoning the historical order of these ideas, it is possible to list in a rough order of importance and the ideas which have had the most general acceptance by the practicing legal professions since the second half of the 19th century. There are several concepts which dominate the series of law in the modern times. First, imperativism. In every country, a legislative authority is recognized with wide competence to make and alter laws, and even to mold the general concepts and techniques of the legal system. And the will of the legislature is recognized as in general superior to other sources of positive law, subject only to the effect of fundamental guarantees of human rights or federal distributions of power in the few cases where these exist in legal form. And secondly, with the positivism, the assumption of the lawyer is that in the ordinary transactions of daily life, in a wide range of dispute cases, an appropriate legal rule producing the desired transactional consequences or enabling the dispute to be settled will be discovered in the existing rules of system, whatever their origin, handled by reference to the action, definitions, and rules of operation which the particular legal system has developed. Even where a problem represents new or unfamiliar features or combinations of features, it is the primary assumption that existing rules will indicate a method of handling the problem. Thus, positivism incorporates a respect for logical procedures, which is not necessarily implied by imperativism. So, the concept, in contrast with a positivism, would be a natural law, which was developed throughout the centuries of Western legal tradition. And natural law generally offers the standard. The specific law may be contested about its legitimacy or a kind of legal values, but there could be found some disagreements between a natural law and the rise of positivism, in which many commentators see the kind of a cause to lead to the World War, broke out of a World War. And later we also visit that point briefly. Third, the concept of justice. Although there have been at times acute divisions of opinion as to the state of legal activity, there is some conception of justice or legal virtue should be relevant. There has always been a strong element within the Western societies as a whole and within the legal professions, contending for some standard of excellence which the law in particular cases ought to achieve. The theory of natural law provides such a standard of criticism for many centuries, as I've introduced. And fourth, the influence of sociological theory and techniques of inquiry, especially in the form these have developed during the 20th century. This has produced a widespread acceptance of the view the law is in some sense the product of identifiable social forces and the possibilities of law reform or of influencing social actions through legal control, while wide in scope are subject to restraints created by the history and structure of the whole society and of particular groups and institutions within the society. It is particularly by reference to the wealth of legal theory and of philosophical and sociological speculation concerning law and its social relations, The Western law in the 20th century may be described as a system informer. We see law as an essential factor in society, which is the ninth point we need to discuss. Western law has at all times been an accepted and respected feature of Western society. This involves something of paradox because the lawyer as an individual or type has often been exceedingly unpopular, and lawyers have often been the forced to suffer in revolutionary situations. Nevertheless, lawyers, the product of the traditions, professional specialization, and characteristic outlook mentioned above, have also always been prominent in the councils of rulers and of revolutionaries alike. A respect for and even a demand for the legal approach to the structuring or ordering of social relations has kept triumphing over the periodic dissatisfactions with a particular structure or order achieved at a particular time and place. Until the development of the radical criticism of law and legal structures associated with Marxian communism and philosophical anarchism, it was assumed in all Western legal thought that an elaborate, well-structured legal system was essential to any form of society. The development of socialist societies in the 20th century has not weakened this Western view, but, if anything, strengthened it. It is still the predominant Western view. The theories of disappearance of law or of its replacement by social administration are utopian.